I watched in fury as the HOA cops deliberately parked their cars across my driveway, blocking access to the vegetable garden that was feeding me through months of unemployment. Little did these neighborhood tyrants know that hidden in the fine print of our county ordinances was the single legal detail that would not only save my garden but expose their entire corrupt scheme to the world. Comment below where you're watching from. The police car slowed down in front of my house, and my heart raced. But it wasn't the police. It was worse. The Pinecrest Hills HOA patrol car, painted to look official with gold badges on the doors, stopped right at my driveway garden. I dropped my watering can and rushed outside. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Reynolds stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing a jacket with HOA enforcement embroidered on the pocket. Her fake blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent frown. "This is completely unacceptable," she said, pointing at my tomato plants. "This used to be a respectable neighborhood. 6 months ago, I lost my engineering job when the factory closed. With bills piling up and no callbacks from applications, I turned my concrete driveway into a mini farm using old pallets and soil bags from the garden center's clearance pile. Every tomato I grew meant one less I had to buy. "It's just vegetables," I explained. "For food." Mrs. Reynolds wrote something on her clipboard. Section 12.3 clearly states all visible landscaping must be approved by the board. "This looks like a junkyard." Right behind her, I could see her own yard with its massive water fountain, definitely not on any approval list I'd seen. "I'll look into the rules," I said calmly. She snapped a photo with her phone. "You have 7 days to remove this eyesore or face daily fines." As her car drove away, my neighbor Raj walked over from his porch. "Don't let her bully you, Mike. She tried making me take down my wind chimes last month, claiming they were noise pollution." "How can she fine me for growing food?" I asked. "Half the neighborhood has gardens, not in their driveways." Raj pointed to the back of his house. "They can't regulate what they can't see from the street. That's why my vegetable patch is behind my fence." I shook my head. "I don't have a backyard, just that tiny patio that gets no sun." "Then you might have real trouble," Raj warned. "Mrs. Reynolds isn't just any HOA board member. Her husband owns the biggest real estate company in town. They're trying to flip this whole neighborhood upside down." That night I couldn't sleep. My driveway garden wasn't just a hobby. It was feeding me while I searched for work. The 20 raised beds produced enough vegetables to cut my grocery bill in half, and I'd been selling extra produce at the farmer's market for gas money. I pulled out my HOA rulebook from when I moved in 3 years ago. The landscaping section was only 2 pages long back then. Now, the updated version Mrs. Reynolds had left was 26 pages, with rules about everything from grass height to the color of garden hoses. Section 12.3 indeed mentioned visible landscaping, needing approval, but it specifically referred to permanent changes. My garden beds sat on top of the driveway. They weren't permanent at all. The next morning, I photographed every inch of my garden. Then I walked around Pinecrest Hills with my phone camera, documenting violations that were being ignored, unapproved basketball hoops, decorative flags, lawn ornaments, and, most importantly, Mrs. Reynolds' massive fountain that sprayed water 10 feet into the air. If they wanted to play by the rule book, I needed to know exactly which rules counted and which didn't. 3 days later, I spotted Mrs. Reynolds and 3 men in matching polo shirts measuring my driveway with laser tools. They were placing orange stickers on my garden beds. "Excuse me," I called out. "This is private property." The tallest man barely looked up. "HOA regulations give us authority to inspect for violations. This garden takes up 63% of your driveway, exceeding the 25% modification allowance. There's nothing in the bylaws about driveway percentages," I challenged. "New amendment? Passed last month," he replied, handing me a paper I'd never seen before. "Effective immediately." As they drove away, I noticed something odd. The paper had today's date, not last month. Were they making up rules just for me? That evening, Mrs. Reynolds parked across the street, taking pictures of everyone who stopped to buy my tomatoes. When Mrs. Gonzalez, the elderly woman from down the block, brought me a homemade pie in exchange for zucchini, Mrs. Reynolds approached her. "You shouldn't encourage rule breakers," I overheard her saying. "This used to be a nice neighborhood before people started turning it into farmland." Mrs. Gonzalez clutched her bag of vegetables. "I've lived here 30 years longer than you, Donna. Back then, everyone grew food and shared with neighbors." "Well, times change," Mrs. Reynolds snapped. "Property values matter now." After Mrs. Gonzalez left, I noticed a white envelope stuck in my garden fence. Inside was a check for $500 and a handwritten note. "For your garden supplies. Don't let them win." It was signed "A Neighbor with No Name." Who would pay $500 to help save my garden? And why were they afraid to tell me who they were? I slept in my living room that night, worried the HOA might try something while I was asleep. Around midnight, headlights swept across my windows. I peeked through the blinds to see Mrs. Reynolds' husband's luxury car idling in front of my house. He was talking on his phone, pointing at my property. Even with the windows closed, I could make out a few words. Perfect location. And after we clear them out, what exactly were they planning? This felt bigger than just my garden beds. Much bigger. And I was about to find out just how far they would go to get what they wanted. Blood-red letters stamped across the envelope made my stomach drop. Final notice before legal action. Inside was a formal letter on heavy paper with the Pinecrest Hills logo embossed in gold. Cease and desist all unauthorized agricultural activities immediately. It stated, the daily fines would start at $100 and double each week until my garden was removed. The letter was signed by Marcus Williams, HOA president, with Mrs. Reynolds' signature underneath as Enforcement Committee Chair. I couldn't afford even one day of these fines. My savings were almost gone after 6 months of unemployment. That evening, while checking my tomato plants for damage, I noticed Raj watching from his driveway. He waved me over, looking around nervously before speaking. They're not just coming after your garden, he whispered. They've got bigger plans. My cousin works for city planning. Reynolds Development just filed papers to build luxury condos in Pinecrest Hills. They can't tear down an entire neighborhood, I said. They don't have to. They just need to make living here so miserable that people sell cheap. He pointed to 3 houses with for sale signs. Notice how they're all being sold by the same real estate company? Reynolds Realty. The pieces clicked together in my head. So the HOA is helping them drive property values down temporarily? Exactly. They buy low, change the zoning, build fancy condos, and make millions. Raj handed me a business card. My sister's a lawyer. She helps people fight predatory HOAs. First consultation is free. The next morning, I called the number and spoke with Priya, Raj's sister. She listened carefully to my story. Their tactics are becoming common, she explained. They create impossible rules, selectively enforce them against certain homeowners, then swoop in to rescue people by buying their homes at 70% of market value. Can they really force me to remove a garden that feeds me? I asked. That's where it gets interesting, Priya said. Most states have laws protecting homeowners' rights to certain activities. I need to research your county's specific ordinances. While waiting to hear back from Priya, I installed security cameras around my property. The anonymous $500 check had given me enough for a decent system, and I had a feeling I'd need proof of whatever happened next. That night, my cameras caught 2 men in dark clothing approaching my garden at 3:17 a.m. They weren't stealing vegetables. They were pouring something on my plants. By morning, half my tomatoes had withered, their leaves turning black. I collected soil samples immediately and called Priya. We need to test this, she said when I showed her the video. If they use chemicals to destroy your garden, that's criminal property damage. The soil tests confirmed my worst fears. Commercial-grade weed killer. Strong enough to contaminate the soil for months. I couldn't simply replant. The entire garden was poisoned. When I returned home from the testing lab, a crowd had gathered in front of my house. Mrs. Reynolds stood in my driveway with Marcus Williams and a police officer. See, officer? I told you. It's a public health hazard, she was saying, pointing at my damaged plants. Who knows what diseases these rotting vegetables might spread? The officer looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, dying plants aren't a police matter. The chemicals they're using could be dangerous, she insisted. What about children who might touch these plants? My blood boiled. They poisoned my garden and were now using that as evidence against me? I approached calmly, phone recording in my pocket. Officer, I have security footage from last night showing 2 individuals trespassing on my property and poisoning my plants with chemicals. I'd like to file a report. Mrs. Reynolds' face flickered with surprise before she regained her composure. That's ridiculous. Why would anyone poison vegetables? I have the soil test results right here, I replied, holding up the lab report. Commercial-grade herbicide, not available to regular consumers. The kind used by professional landscaping companies. The officer took my report seriously, examining the video footage on my phone. Do you recognize either of these individuals? He asked. I couldn't identify them clearly, but their build matched 2 men from the HOA, Enforcement Committee, who had measured my driveway days earlier. As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Reynolds lingered. When the officer was out of earshot, her friendly mask slipped off. You're fighting a losing battle, she hissed. This neighborhood is changing whether you like it or not. Smart people are selling while they can still get decent offers. Why target me specifically? I asked. Other people have gardens. Her smile turned cold. Your house sits on the corner lot we need for the development entrance. The faster you leave, the better for everyone. As she walked away, my phone buzzed with a text from Priya. Found something. County Ordinance 47-9. No homeowner association may restrict reasonable food cultivation during declared drought emergencies. We're still under the drought declaration from last summer. Call me ASAP. My poisoned garden lay in ruins, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Mrs. Reynolds and her HOA cops thought they had all the power, but they had overlooked one crucial legal detail. Now I just needed proof connecting them to the garden vandalism, and I knew exactly where to start looking. I rushed home from my job interview, spotting strange figures on my property from 2 blocks away. 3 men in identical blue, polo shirts with HOA enforcement embroidered on their chests were crawling around my garden beds with measuring tapes and clipboards. My heart raced. They hadn't wasted any time. What exactly do you think you're doing? I called out, nearly tripping as I ran from my car. You can't just walk onto my property. The tallest man, a gray-haired guy with a military-style haircut, didn't even look up from his laser measuring tool. Actually, we can. I'm Doug Peterson, head of enforcement. HOA bylaws, section 22(1). Gives us full authority to inspect any visible violations. There's nothing in the bylaws about garden size, I argued, stepping between him and my prized beefsteak tomatoes. Doug finally looked at me, his face completely blank like he'd practiced this 1,000 times. Section 14(7), aesthetic consistency requirements. This garden is exactly 8.2 square feet larger than permissible lawn conversion. Plus, the tomato stakes exceed height restrictions by 3 inches. A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather at the edge of my lawn. I spotted Mrs. Reynolds watching from her BMW, sunglasses perched on her nose despite the cloudy day, a tiny smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Show me where it says I can't grow food, I demanded, reaching for Doug's clipboard. He yanked it away. We've received 7 separate complaints about odors, insects, and unsightly vegetation. The HOA board voted unanimously last night to take immediate action. Last night? I wasn't notified of any meeting, I protested. Emergency session, Doug replied flatly. Properly posted on the community bulletin board at the pool that had been closed for renovations for 3 weeks. One of the other men, younger with slicked back hair, emerged from my backyard. My backyard! Sir, we've documented additional violations behind the property. Compost bin exceeds size restrictions. Rain barrel not on approved list. Chicken wire not on approved materials list. You went into my backyard without permission? I was shouting now, which I realized was exactly what they wanted, to make me look unstable in front of the growing audience. I took a deep breath. I'll need copies of all these supposed violations in writing, plus documentation showing where in the HOA agreement each item is prohibited. Doug smirked. Already prepared. He handed me a thick folder. You have 72 hours to remedy all violations or fines. Begin at 100 per day. Per violation. We've documented 16 separate violations. That's 1,600 daily. More than my monthly mortgage. I flipped through the paperwork, looking for any mistakes. Any overreach I could challenge. The HOA had been meticulous, except for one thing. This document is addressed to the property owner, I pointed out. I'm a renter. For the first time, Doug's composure cracked. We'll need to update that. Small victory, but I'd take it. As the enforcement team packed up, they stuck large neon orange violation notices on each of my garden beds. Mrs. Reynolds finally emerged from her car, strutting across the street in designer heels that sank slightly into the grass. Such a shame, she announced loudly to nobody in particular. Some people just refuse to understand community standards. I bit my tongue, remembering my landlord had mentioned she was on the HOA financial committee that controlled my security deposit. As the crowd thinned, my next-door neighbor Raj whispered, "Don't give up. They tried this with my backyard pizza oven last year." I nodded gratefully, but my thoughts were racing through calculations. How much savings did I have? How long could I fight this? What would happen to my garden, my food source, in the meantime? An unexpected voice broke through my panic. "Young man?" "Excuse me." Mrs. Gonzalez, the 80-year-old widow from the blue house on the corner, tapped her cane on my driveway. She carried a cloth-covered basket. "Your tomatoes helped with my arthritis salve last month," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "My husband and I grew victory gardens during the war. This isn't right." She handed me the basket. Warm empanadas and a jar of homemade salsa. "Thank you," I whispered, touched by this small kindness. "Come, I'll show you something they don't want you to know," she said, gesturing toward her house. I walked Mrs. Gonzalez home, listening as she explained how the HOA had changed when Mrs. Reynolds joined 3 years ago. "They care more about appearances than people now," she sighed. I promised to visit properly tomorrow and hurried back to start reading through the violations folder, looking for any weaknesses in their case. The street was quiet now, the drama apparently over. But as I approached my driveway, a sickly sweet chemical smell hit me. My steps quickened. The garden beds looked wrong. The vibrant greens had dulled. Leaves curled at the edges. A plastic spray bottle lay partially hidden under the zucchini plants. I touched a tomato leaf. It crumbled between my fingers. Every single plant, weeks of work, my upcoming meals, the only productive thing in my unemployment, had been deliberately sprayed with weed killer. I sank to my knees in the dirt, rage and disbelief washing over me. Through tears, I noticed a small slip of paper tucked into one of the dead plants. Neat handwriting read, "Next time, follow the rules. Who would destroy perfectly good food? And what kind of person had I become their enemy? They poisoned your food?" Raj's voice boomed across 3 houses as he examined my dead garden the next morning. His normally calm face turned red with anger. "That's not enforcement. That's vandalism." I hadn't slept, spending the night photographing every withered leaf, every chemical burned stem, and the spray bottle left behind. When Raj saw the follow the rules note, he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he insisted. "This is destruction of property." 2 officers arrived quickly. They took notes, bagged the bottle for fingerprints, but their expressions told me everything. This would go nowhere. "Civil matter," the younger officer muttered. "HOA disputes aren't criminal unless there's major property damage. These plants were worth hundreds of dollars," I argued. "File a claim with your renter's insurance," he suggested before walking away. Raj placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, this isn't over." He wasn't kidding. Within an hour, he'd posted pictures in our neighborhood Facebook group. By noon, my phone buzzed nonstop with angry neighbors I'd never even met. At 2 p.m., a knock at my door revealed Mrs. Gonzalez holding a tray of seedlings. "Tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers," she announced. "Already started them for my grandchildren, but they need them more than you do." Before I could properly thank her, another car pulled up. Tom and Sarah Johnson, the young couple from Oak Street, carried lumber, soil, and fresh garden stakes. "We read about what happened," Sarah said. "Tom's a carpenter. We thought we could help rebuild somewhere. They can't mess with it." My tiny living room filled with unexpected allies. Mr. Abernathy, the quiet retired man from the corner house, brought printouts of county regulations and property laws. The HOA fined me $500 for installing a wheelchair ramp. When my Martha was dying, he explained, voice shaking slightly, said it wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. Had to remove it a week before she passed. He fixed me with watery blue eyes. It's time someone stood up to these bullies. More neighbors arrived, the Patels with samosas and legal advice. Mrs. Patel was a paralegal. The Gonzalez grandchildren with hand-painted signs reading, "Food is not a violation." Even shy Ms. Rodriguez, who I'd only waved to before brought state gardening protection pamphlets. "Did you know," Raj said, spreading maps across my coffee table, "that HOA regulation enforcement is limited to front-facing visible elements? Backyards have fewer restrictions." Tom nodded, sketching quick garden bed designs. "We could build raised beds behind your fence line. They'd need a warrant to even see them." Mrs. Gonzalez tapped her cane for attention. "In 1943, the government encouraged victory gardens during rationing. I still have the pamphlets proving food gardens were considered patriotic duty. The real issue," Mr. Abernathy interrupted, "is selective enforcement. Look at these." He spread photographs showing various HOA violations throughout Pinecrest Hills. Mrs. Reynolds' own non-approved fountain. The HOA president's oversized boat parked in his driveway. The board treasurer's unapproved flag display. "They're picking targets," Mrs. Patel confirmed. "Only enforcing rules against certain people." The Pinecrest Freedom Coalition formed that very afternoon in my living room. Our first action, moving my garden operation to the backyard, legally outside. HOA direct purview, while documenting every instance of selective rule enforcement. As everyone helped install new garden beds behind my fence, Mrs. Gonzalez supervised from a lawn chair. "When I moved here 30 years ago, neighbors helped each other," she reminisced, "before these fancy rules took over. By sunset, I had new garden beds, filled with fresh soil and Mrs. Gonzalez's seedlings. The coalition had assigned roles, Mr. Abernathy researching legal precedents, the Patels documenting violations, Raj creating a secure online forum for affected homeowners. As everyone left, promising to meet again in 2 days, a strange feeling washed over me. I'd lost my garden but gained something more valuable. A community. I stayed outside watering the new plants until dark. The quiet purr of a luxury sedan made me look up. A black BMW crept past my house, then stopped. The window rolled down, revealing Marcus Williams, HOA president himself. "Got a minute?" he asked, voice low. I approached cautiously, garden hose still in hand. "Look," he sighed. "I didn't approve what happened to your garden. That went too far." "Then why not stop it?" I demanded. Marcus glanced around nervously. This isn't just about your garden. Mrs. Reynolds is running for city council. She needs this neighborhood, looking perfect for her campaign. Photographers coming next week. The pieces clicked together. So this whole crackdown is about her political ambitions? I didn't say that, he backpedaled quickly. But between us, she's using her HOA position as a launching pad. Wants to show she can clean up a neighborhood. That doesn't give anyone the right to destroy food, I countered. No, it doesn't, he agreed, surprising me. But I'm warning you. If you keep fighting, they'll find other violations. Your fence is half an inch too tall. Your mailbox is the wrong shade of brown. They measured your grass last week. It's 1/8 inch over regulation height. They'll bankrupt you with fines. I studied his face, trying to understand his angle. Why tell me this? Because I've lived here 20 years. This used to be a real neighborhood. He shook his head. But watch your back. Mrs. Reynolds doesn't like losing. As his BMW disappeared around the corner, water still running over my shoes, a realization hit me like cold rain. This battle had transformed completely. It wasn't just about defending my little garden anymore. It was about power, control, and one woman's ruthless, political ambitions that threatened the whole community. And in his warning, Marcus Williams had just handed me exactly what we needed to fight back. Got it, I shouted, nearly spilling my coffee as I found the hidden rule. My hands trembled as I read the county ordinance. Section 47(9) jumped off the page. No homeowner association may restrict reasonable food cultivation during declared drought emergencies. I checked the county website again. We were still officially under the drought emergency declaration from last summer. This was it, my golden ticket. Raj, look at this, I whispered over the phone at 11:30 that night. They broke actual county law by destroying my garden. That's huge, he replied, but we need to play this smart. Mrs. Reynolds has friends at City Hall. Over the next 3 days, our little coalition gathered evidence. Mrs. Gonzalez remembered when the HOA approved Mr. Peterson's massive koi pond during the same drought. Mr. Abernathy found photos of board members' yards with unapproved structures. Sarah Johnson, a paralegal, helped us organize everything into a bulletproof presentation. The monthly HOA meeting arrived on a stormy Tuesday. Attendance was usually low, exactly how the board liked it. But tonight, thanks to our phone campaign, nearly 60 residents packed into the community center. Mrs. Reynolds tapped her microphone impatiently. First agenda item, exterior violations in Zone 3. We've noted 17 infractions. I stood up, 50 copies of the county ordinance clutched in my hands. Point of order, I said clearly, walking to the front. Before we continue, I'd like to address the illegal destruction of my garden. Mrs. Reynolds' smile hardened. This isn't on the agenda. Please sit down or you'll be removed. I think everyone here needs to see this, I replied, passing out the ordinance copies. My garden was legally protected under county law. The HOA violated this ordinance when you destroyed my food plants during an active drought emergency. Mrs. Reynolds snatched a copy, scanning it quickly. Her face flushed. This is irrelevant. Our bylaws clearly state, county law supersedes HOA regulations. Raj interrupted, standing beside me. That's not opinion, that's legal fact. And we've documented every violation the board has selectively enforced, added Mrs. Gonzalez, surprising everyone with her forceful tone. She opened a photo album. My daughter took these pictures last year. Here's Mrs. Reynolds' new fence, 2 feet taller than regulations allow. Here's Mr. Peterson's boat parked in his driveway for 6 months. Against Section 8 rules, the room buzzed with whispers. People began raising hands, then simply standing up. You approved the Miller's pool but denied my children's basketball hoop. You forced the Smiths to remove their religious symbol, but allowed others to keep theirs. You fined me for my garden gnomes, but said nothing about the Williams lawn flamingos. Mrs. Reynolds banged her gavel desperately. Order! This meeting will come to— Why the different rules, Mrs. Reynolds? I asked, raising my voice just enough. Is it because some people are running for city council and need certain neighbors gone? The room fell silent. I hadn't meant to reveal that card so soon, but her panicked expression told me I'd hit the mark. Marcus Williams, usually silent at meetings, suddenly spoke. Perhaps we should table this discussion and consult our HOA attorney before proceeding. Excellent idea, I replied. That gives Channel 7 News time to prepare their story. They're very interested in how an HOA destroyed food gardens during economic hardship while allowing water-wasting decorative features for board members. Great headline for someone running for city council, don't you think? Mrs. Reynolds' face turned ghostly white. For a moment, I thought we'd won. That's when Doug Peterson, her loyal committee member, whispered something in her ear. Her color returned, followed by a cold smile. This meeting is adjourned, she announced. Security, please escort these disruptive individuals out. Two men I'd never seen before approached us. Not security guards, these were private muscle in cheap suits. "You'll regret this," Raj muttered as we were ushered out. "They've got nothing," I assured everyone outside. "We have the law on our side." Mrs. Gonzalez squeezed my hand. "You did well, mijo. But powerful people play dirty." Her words proved prophetic. At 6:17 the next morning, a loud knock woke me. A stranger handed me an official-looking envelope and walked away without a word. Inside was an eviction notice, effective immediately. 30 days to vacate. The letter claimed my rental agreement had been purchased by a new owner, who wished to occupy the property. The new owner? Pinecrest Capital LLC. I called my original landlord in a panic. "Sorry, man," he said. "Got an offer I couldn't refuse. Sold the place last week." My hands shook as I searched online for Pinecrest Capital. Nothing came up except an address, the same as the HOA office. How can I fight for the neighborhood? I whispered to my withering tomato plants. If I can't even keep my home? I couldn't sleep. The eviction notice sat on my kitchen table like a ticking bomb. 30 days. The timing wasn't a coincidence. "This doesn't make sense," Raj said, pacing my living room the next evening. "They're going to crazy lengths to stop one garden." "It's not about the garden anymore," Mr. Abernathy said quietly. All heads turned to the elderly man who rarely spoke above a whisper. "It's about making an example. If you win, others might challenge them too." Sarah Johnson, our paralegal friend, frowned at the eviction papers. "This Pinecrest Capital LLC, something smells fishy. No web presence, no corporate history. Could be a shell company," suggested Tom. "But why bother for one small house?" Mrs. Gonzalez, who'd arrived with a casserole despite her arthritis flaring, suddenly perked up. "What if it's not just your house?" The room fell silent as we considered this. "Check the property records," Mr. Abernathy suggested. "I worked in real estate for 40 years. The county keeps all sales in public databases." I booted up my old laptop while Sarah made calls to former colleagues. 2 hours later, our jaws dropped collectively. Pinecrest Capital. "Purchased 7 properties in our neighborhood in the past 3 months," Sarah announced, spreading printouts across my coffee table. "All on the north side near the main road. And look at this," I added, turning my laptop around. "Pinecrest Capital LLC was registered just 4 months ago. The listed agent is M. Williams Consulting." "Marcus Williams?" Raj exclaimed. "The HOA president?" Mr. Abernathy nodded grimly. "Classic move. I've seen it before in other neighborhoods. First, enforce strict rules to lower property values and upset homeowners. Then buy properties cheap from frustrated sellers. But why target the north side specifically?" Mrs. Gonzalez wondered. Tom Johnson, who worked for the city transportation department, pulled out his phone. After a few minutes of searching, he whistled low. "Folks, the city council is voting next month on a commercial zoning expansion along Murray Road. If approved, residential properties there could be converted to businesses. The north side of our neighborhood bordered Murray Road, so this isn't about my garden at all," I said slowly. "They're trying to flip the whole neighborhood. Mrs. Reynolds gets elected to city council to push through the rezoning, while Marcus Williams quietly buys up properties to sell at a massive profit. And anyone who causes trouble gets targeted by the HOA until they leave." Raj finished. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The suddenly strict enforcement, the property purchases, Mrs. Reynolds' campaign focused on neighborhood improvement and economic development. Sarah squinted at another document. "There's more. Pinecrest Capital made a $25,000 donation to Reynolds for city council last month." "That can't be legal," I said. "It's a gray area," Sarah replied. "Technically, a business can donate to campaigns. We need to go public," Tom insisted. "This is corruption, plain and simple. They'll deny everything," I cautioned. "We need solid, undeniable proof of the connection between the HOA enforcement, the property purchases, and the rezoning plan." Raj's teenage daughter, who had been quietly listening while doing homework, looked up. "Mrs. Reynolds' campaign website says she's hosting a donor reception tomorrow night at the country club. What if someone could get in and hear what she's telling her supporters?" We all exchanged glances. "I serve at those events sometimes," Mrs. Gonzalez said. "The catering company always needs extra hands. They never look twice at the help." The plan formed quickly. Mrs. Gonzalez would work the event. Tom would use his city employee badge to access planning department files. Sarah would dig deeper into the property records. "What about your eviction?" Raj asked me quietly as others discussed strategy. "One battle at a time," I replied. "Saving the neighborhood comes first." The next evening, we waited anxiously for Mrs. Gonzalez's call. When my phone finally rang at 11:22 p.m., her voice trembled with excitement. "You won't believe what I heard," she whispered. "Mrs. Reynolds told the donors they'd see a 300% return on investment once the Pinecrest Hills commercial corridor is approved. She showed maps. They're planning to demolish the whole north section for shops and restaurants. Did she mention the HOA's role? I asked. Better. Marcus Williams was there, introducing her as the partner who will make our vision reality. He bragged about how they've been encouraging turnover in key properties. She paused. And mijo? They specifically mentioned your house as the last holdout in Phase 1. My stomach dropped. No wonder they attacked my garden so aggressively. My house sat at the future entrance to their planned development. There's one more thing, Mrs. Gonzalez added. The vote for rezoning happens next Tuesday. If it passes, nothing can stop them. 5 days. We had 5 days to stop a corrupt HOA president, a power-hungry city council candidate, and their wealthy backers from destroying our neighborhood. And I still had that eviction hanging over my head. I stared at my struggling garden plants, recently replanted after the destruction. Against all odds, tiny green shoots were pushing through the soil. We're not going down without a fight, I told them, reaching for my phone to call the local news station. Sometimes the smallest plants have the deepest roots. I clutched the folder of evidence as I walked into the packed community center. You ready? Raj whispered. My heart pounded, but there was no turning back. Mrs. Reynolds stood at the front, her perfect smile freezing when she spotted the Channel 7 news van pulling up outside. Before we discuss garden violations, I announced, moving to the center of the room. Everyone should see these documents. I held up property maps highlighting all the homes receiving violation notices. Notice anything strange about these marked houses? The crowd murmured as I overlaid another map, the secret redevelopment plan we'd discovered filed with the county. The marked homes matched exactly with Phase 1 of the luxury condo project. This isn't about my tomatoes, I said, voice steady despite my shaking hands. It's about forcing certain people out of their homes. Mrs. Reynolds lunged for the microphone. He's lying! This meeting is about rule violations, nothing more. That's when Mrs. Gonzalez slowly stood up, leaning on her cane. Then explain why your brother-in-law bought 6 properties in our neighborhood through shell companies last month. The news cameras swung toward Mrs. Reynolds, whose face turned redder than my prized tomatoes. Or why Pinecrest Development LLC donated $25,000 to your campaign? Added Mr. Abernathy, holding up campaign finance reports. Marcus Williams tried slipping out the back door, but ran straight into the county inspector I'd invited. Going somewhere, Mr. Williams? We have questions about these rezoning applications with your signature. Mrs. Reynolds knocked over a water pitcher trying to reach the exit. This meeting is over. My lawyer will what? I asked calmly. Explain why you destroyed food gardens during a legally declared drought emergency. That's against County Law 47.9, which I've highlighted for the reporters. 2 weeks later, official letters arrived at every home in Pinecrest Hills. The HOA board was suspended pending investigation. Mrs. Reynolds, campaign manager, announced her withdrawal from the city council race. For personal reasons, the rezoning application mysteriously disappeared. Most importantly, my garden didn't just survive, it thrived. This spring marks 1 year since our victory. Where one garden stood, 37 now bloom throughout the neighborhood. Yesterday, the school bus stopped so kids could see Mr. Abernathy's giant pumpkins, Mrs. Gonzalez's salsa recipe. Using my tomatoes won the county fair blue ribbon. Raj's solar panel design powers our community garden irrigation system. Best of all, the new neighborhood association, not HOA, meets monthly in my backyard, where we share seeds, stories, and support. Mrs. Reynolds moved away last fall. I sent her a basket of homegrown vegetables as a goodbye gift with a note. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is knowing the law, better than those who try to use it against you. I look at my garden now, spreading beautifully across what was once just a driveway, and smile. One small seed of resistance bloomed into something nobody can bulldoze away. Not bad for a garden that was lowering property values.